I want to read to you a story before we dive into 2 Corinthians. If you're a Christian, this is part of your heritage. This is a story of a guy named Walter Milne. He lived in Scotland. And in 1551, he was 82 years old. It says this. Finally, Oliphant, the archbishop's priest, faced the feeble old man. Will you recant? If not, I will sentence you. Walter Milne replied, I am accused of my life. I know I must die once, and therefore, as Christ said to Judas, what thou dost, do quickly. I will not recant the truth. I am corn, not chaff. I will not be blown away with the wind or burst by the flail. I will survive both. Walter Milne, once a parish priest, heard the gospel and was converted. He was put in prison for his beliefs, but he escaped. He hid for a while, and then he began to preach again. He was forced into hiding a second time, but was finally captured and tried for heresy at the age of 82. At his trial, he was so feeble, both in his age and the mistreatment he suffered in prison, that he couldn't climb the platform. Nevertheless, when he began to speak, he made the courtroom ring with such courage and power that the Christians who were present rejoiced. One by one, his beliefs were examined, and he did not give in. Oliphant sentenced Milne to be burned as a heretic. But his boldness and faith had so moved the heart of the mayor that he refused to be his judge. In fact, the whole town was so offended by Milne's unfair sentence that they refused to sell the bishop a single rope or tar barrel. After much delay, everything was ready. When Oliphant offered him to climb up to the stake, he refused. No, by the law of God, I am forbidden to kill myself. But if you will put me up there and take part in my death, I'll go up gladly. Oliphant lifted the old man up to the stake. Milne prayed. Then he addressed the people. He said this, Dear friends, I do not suffer today for any crime, but only the defense of the faith of Jesus Christ, as set forth in the Old and New Testament. As other faithful martyrs have offered themselves gladly, knowing that they will receive eternal joy, I praise God today that he has called me also to seal up his truth with my life. I have received this life from him, and I willingly offer it for his glory. If you too would escape eternal death, depend only on Jesus and his mercy, that you may be delivered from eternal judgment. While Milne spoke, there was a great mourning in the crowd. As the fire was lit, he cried, Lord, have mercy on me. Pray, people, while there is still time. The crowd was greatly stirred and moved by his words and prayers. Their hearts were so inflamed by his death that thousands joined him in faith. So many declared themselves willing to die for their beliefs that the Scottish government re-examined their views on executing heretics. After the death of Walter Milne, no one else was put to death for their faith in Scotland. We've been talking about in 2 Corinthians chapter 4, the effects of this covenant, this promise that Paul unpacks in chapter 3. In chapter 3, he theologically unpacks the foundation for almost the entire rest of the book. And the foundation that he sets is this new covenant. That's not just another set of rules. That's the Spirit of God living inside of you. It's completely different than the old covenant. And then in chapter 4, he starts on talking about the effects of what it looks like to have the Spirit of God living inside you. What does it really look like to live as a Christian, or what should it look like? Last week, if you were here with us, we talked about how the reality of the Christian life is not necessarily what's always preached on television. That's not always this health, wealth, and prosperity, that sometimes the Christian life comes with suffering. And we talked about how the reality of that is the case is because here's how it really is. It's really an immeasurable treasure. It's the Spirit of God living inside fragile vessels, that's you and me, in a broken world. And because we live in a broken world, suffering still happens. Even though we've believed, even though we've received this powerful treasure and it's living inside of us, there's still this suffering that comes. What we're going to do today is we're going to look a little more closely at the suffering. What does it really kind of look like, and how should we view it? How should we understand the reason why righteous people suffer? And when I say righteous people, that term comes with some baggage, because other places in the Bible, specifically Romans, talks about how no one's righteous. And he goes on and on, that's Paul talking, he goes on and on saying about how no one's righteous, and that's really the real problem. We're sinful, we're unrighteous, and God's righteous, and we can't be with him because he's righteous and we're not. And so Paul uses this word, righteous, to mean the opposite of this problem that we have inside of us. But that's not what we're talking about today. When I say righteous people today, what I'm talking about today is just simply people who are choosing right things. I'm not talking about eternal salvation. I'm not talking about any of that stuff. I'm just talking about people who are making right choices with the things they're doing. They're being honest. They're being hardworking. They're not gossiping. They're not slandering. They're not lying, cheating, stealing. People who are just doing right things. We would call them a righteous person. But the reality is even people who tell the truth, even people who are not going around backstabbing and slandering people and gossiping about people, even people who are not abusing other people, are still suffering. So the question then becomes, why is that? Why do people who do right things still suffer? Why is it that when we tell the truth, sometimes we still get reamed for it? Why is it that when we stand up for what's right, sometimes it still comes back to bite us? I'll give you the easiest answer. The easiest answer is also somewhat the dimmest. The easiest churchy answer is there's sin in the world. We, the creature, decided to subvert our nature and try to be the creator. We decided we want to make the rules. We want to decide what's right. We want to be God. And so we did, and we ruined everything. And in the process of ruining everything for ourselves, it bleeds over. So even if I'm truthful, even if I'm being right in my living, so-and-so who's living next to me, not right, bleeds over into my life. And so sometimes we suffer as a result of other people's junk. I say dim because we don't control other people. So it's kind of like, well, what do you want me to do about that? Well, nothing. You can't. They have to make their choices, and sometimes their choices are going to make you suffer. But there's a different answer that Paul gives to that question. Why do righteous people suffer? Why do people who have Jesus, why do people who have the gospel, why is it not just you have the Spirit living inside of you and then you're blessed and you're healthy and you're alive and you're living? Why is it that people who are really righteous from the core inside out, you received Jesus and he made you righteous from the inside out? Why is it that we still suffer? Paul gives an answer that's not the easiest answer. And yet, I think it will help. We're in 1 Corinthians chapter 4. We're in verse 10. And we're going to go on down through verse 14. Paul has just gotten done describing how although he's persecuted, although he experiences this suffering, there's still hope, there's still life. We read verse 10 last week, but it kind of goes with this section as well, so I'm going to read it. Verse 10 and verse 11 basically say the same thing. They just repeat. So starting in verse 10, Paul says this: always carrying in the body the death of Jesus, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our bodies. And then he says it again in a different way. For we who live are always being given over to death for Jesus' sake, so that the life of Jesus may also be manifested in our mortal flesh. Here's basic what he's saying. You don't get the life of Christ without the death of Christ. He's saying death reigns in us so that we can have life. He's saying we are always being given over to death so that the life of Jesus may also be over in us. You don't just get to have the cake in this story. He's saying as a Christian, we're always carrying the death of Christ with us because you don't get the life of Christ apart from the death of Christ. You can't separate the two. I talked a little bit about righteous suffering. And we've talked about this already in the book. We talked about it in chapter 1, how Paul's not suffering because of his own bad choices. That's something completely different. You're suffering because of your own bad choices. That makes sense. That's normal. You can trace that back. This is happening in my life because I made this dumb choice. But that's not what's happening to Paul. Paul's suffering at the hands of the Corinthian church, and he's living everything rightly, and yet he's still suffering. And so he's trying to figure that out. The reason why I know, even here in this chapter, that Paul's still talking about righteous suffering is because in verse 11, it says, for we who live are always being given over. That's a passive verb. When I say a passive verb, I mean the subject is not the one doing the action. Always being handed over. That means Paul's not being handed over for something he did. He's not handing himself over. He's being handed over by someone else. It's righteous suffering because it's not a result of what Paul did. You don't get the life of Christ without following in the footsteps of Christ. Following in the footsteps of Christ towards life, but sometimes you follow through suffering towards life. This is exactly what Jesus was talking about in Luke chapter 9 when he tells his disciples, you want to follow me? Pick up your cross and follow me. Pick up your cross. Pick up your instrument of death. Pick up whatever it is that you need to die to and carry it as you follow me. Not like carry it and then put it down and then come follow me. No, put it up, pick it up on your back, and just carry it as you follow him constantly. You don't get the life of Christ without constantly clinging to the death of Christ. There's a result that comes when we partake in this suffering, when we're living the right way and yet we're still suffering. There's a result that comes that Paul points out that we're not often aware of. It's in verse 12. And it's kind of confusing when you read it until you understand that Paul's suffering for no reason. And verse 12 says, so death is at work in us, but life in you. Reality is the people who are in Corinth and Paul together are clinging to the death of Christ, and they're also living. But here's what Paul's saying. Paul's suffering for the sake of the Corinthians. He's already said this to us in chapter 1. We talked about this already. When he opens this book and he's talking about comfort, and he's saying, I'm being comforted by God in my suffering so that I can turn and give my comfort to you so that you can be comforted so that you can be saved. Same thing he's talking about here. Death is at work in us, so life is at work in you. I'm suffering so that you can have life. Result number 1 of sometimes why righteous Christians suffer. You suffer so that other people can live. It's the pattern that God set up. It's following in the footsteps of Christ. He suffered so that we could live. And then he says, you want to follow me? Follow me. But pick up your cross. Don't just follow me into life. Follow me into suffering. How do you know that, though? I mean, how do you know? How do I know that if I just walk into this suffering, that it's going to turn out right? I mean, how do I know that it's not just going to get worse and worse and worse and worse and then I'm dead? Even this guy wasn't afraid of that. But most of us will never get to that point. So how do we know? How do we know that if we keep on living, just accepting the fact that, man, we're trying to live right and it just seems like we're still suffering? How do we know that we know that on the other side there's life? He answers that question in the next two verses. Read verse 13. It says, Since we have the same spirit of faith, according to what has been written, I believed and so I spoke, we also believe and we also speak, knowing that he who raised the Lord Jesus will also raise us with Jesus and bring us with you into his presence. Here's what Paul's banking on. He's looking at the story. He's going, Christ suffered. Then he rose from the dead. Then he ascended to heaven. That's where I'm headed. And he's looking at his suffering through the lens of, well, if I'm following Christ and Christ suffered first, then the next step for me is resurrection, and the step after that is to be with Christ in heaven. This is looking past the suffering. This is looking to someplace different. Here's how I know this is what he's talking about. It's this really weird quotation in verse 13. Some of you have little references in your Bible, and if you do, you'll see that quotation in verse 13 where Paul says, since we have the same spirit of faith according to what has been written, and then he quotes this Old Testament psalm, I believed, and so I spoke. And if you go back to that Old Testament psalm and you read it, you might think, Paul, that's not what this psalm is saying. Like, the psalm's not talking about preaching the gospel. Like, the psalm's not talking about talking to God. I don't understand. Like, why are you saying this? It's a really weird quotation for Paul to just throw this in here. If you just read it outright, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Here's what you need to know about sometimes when people in the New Testament use the Old Testament. Sometimes they're not just linking the words. Sometimes they're also linking the themes. And they're using the words to link the themes. Here's why we often miss these things, is because we're not quite familiar enough with the scriptures. And even when I read it, I was like, what? Like, what kind of interpretation is that? That's not what that psalm says at all. Here's what he's doing, and he's already demonstrated it for us. I don't know if you remember a couple weeks ago when Jesus was talking about, at the end of the last chapter, when Jesus mentioned the image of God, and then he mentioned the jars of clay at the beginning of the 4th chapter, and I told you underneath of all of that is Genesis. Because the first time we see that image of God, and then when we see God creating humanity, we see the vessels of clay, same language, and so there's Genesis in behind it. And what he's trying to get at in that whole section is just this idea of we're the created, he's the creator. And that's underlying the section. See, but he uses words to signify the themes. So he's pulling in these words like image of God and jars of clay, which in the context is like, Okay, this is just a weird metaphor. Like, doesn't make much sense. But he's getting at the theme. Creator created. He's doing the same thing here. You know what the theme of that psalm is that he quoted from? Suffering. And he knows it. And the people in that psalm were suffering, and it seems like if you read the psalm, they weren't suffering because of something they did. It was a righteous sort of suffering. And so when he's thinking about his own situation and he's thinking, man, I shouldn't be getting all this. I've treated these people well. I've been truthful with them. I've done everything that was best for them, and they're turning on me. It's no wonder that psalm comes into his mind. And it's no wonder then that it picks up in his text. I believed, and so I spoke. The next question is, what actually is it maybe that Paul believed? Maybe it's that he believed by faith the same thing that the psalmist believed, which is that when righteous people suffer unrighteously, God redeems. And that's what he's telling them. He's saying, look, we believe this. God redeems. We believe this. When you call out to God, he answers. He saves. And so we speak it. And in that suffering, he's then looking forward to Jesus Christ being raised, him being raised, and the people he's speaking to also being raised. Because the result of our suffering sometimes is that other people around us live. And when they live, they become righteous, and they get raised with Christ at the end as well. It's part 2 of the reality of living with the Spirit of God. It's following in the footsteps of Christ. The first part of the reality was just a description of who we are. We're fragile vessels living with an immeasurable treasure inside of us in a broken world. That's just who we are as Christians. This is how that gets played out, following in the footsteps of Christ. You follow in the suffering, and then Paul clings to the hope of following in the resurrection, of following into the presence of God. Listen to how he says it in verse 15. For it is all for your sake, so that as grace extends to more and more people, it may increase thanksgiving to the glory of God. Here's what walking in the footsteps of Christ is supposed to look like. It's supposed to look like Christ. Listen, Christ came, suffered, died, raised from the dead, resurrected, ascended to heaven to be with God. Our life as a Christian, listen, got to follow the same path. Suffering, resurrection, heaven with God. Does your life seem to be following that path? On earth, that path looks like, as you suffer, other people gain life. As they gain life, they become thankful, which is how you and I should be. We're thankful then together, and then together we end up glorifying God. Listen to verse 15 again. For it is all for your sake, so that grace extends. Paul suffers, he extends grace. When they receive the grace extends more and more people. It may increase thanksgiving. People around you receive the grace by faith. They live. They become thankful because they have now that immeasurable treasure living inside them that you have. And the result is to the glory of God. Both you and them. Does the flow of your life look like that? If it doesn't, where'd you get off the train? Did you get off the train at thankfulness? Thanksgiving for the fact that grace was extended to you? Maybe you got off the train when the suffering hit. And you were like, this is not the train I signed up for. I didn't know what I was getting into. Or maybe you saw the first sign of suffering and you were like, I'm out. Suffering so that, in the end, people live and we end up glorifying God. Let me make a qualification. Here's what I don't mean. Because sometimes it's easy to hear, you just need to keep on suffering so that God can be glorified in the end. And I know to people sitting in the room who have husbands or wives who are abusive, that's the wrong message. Don't hear me say that. Because suffering at the hands of somebody who's abusing you is not a form of righteous suffering. It's just self-torture. So when I say suffer for the glory of God, what I'm not saying is you need to stay in that relationship with that person who's beaten on you. And that's not the kind of righteous suffering I'm talking about. But it gets twisted that way real easy. The kind of righteous suffering that I'm talking about is you hold a standard of living for your life and people call you intolerant. You're truthful when the guy sitting next to you in the cubicle is like, dude, if you're honest about that, you could lose your job. Yeah, I know. Made a dumb choice. And he's like, you're a crazy nut job. Like, you can't do that. Or when somebody is like talking to you about so-and-so down the cubicles three down, and you're like, can we not talk about her? Because she's not here, and we just don't need to be talking about her. And that person's like, what, you think you're better than her? You think you're better than me? Because they're all offended now because you just caught them in their gossip, and now they're upset? Is that what people do? You don't have to subject yourself to continued abuse. That's not righteous suffering. If you're not a Christian, and you haven't seen inside the church, because I know the church doesn't always portray this picture of we're willing to suffer for each other so that each one of us can live, so that we can be thankful together, so that we can all glorify God. I know we don't always portray that to one another, so if you're not a Christian and you're coming to the church and you've never seen that pattern happen, and you're like, that's Paul maybe did it like 1,000 years ago, but we don't have that now, so why would I want to be a part of a church? Hold out for it. It's the way it's supposed to be. We're supposed to be sacrificing for each other so that we can live, so that together we can be thankful, so that together we can glorify God. And I know it doesn't always look like that. Wait for it. The question is, why do righteous people suffer? Why do people who do the right things end up suffering? The rest of the world who's not Christian, they suffer because there's sin in the world. It doesn't matter how many times you do the right thing, other people's junk still bleeds over on you. If you're a Christian and you're still suffering and you're like, what gives? It's what you signed up for. I know maybe you weren't aware of it at the beginning. I definitely wasn't. But there's an aspect of the Christian faith when you said, I want to follow Jesus, where that's exactly the path that he took. And you might have to take it too. We suffer because we're following in the footsteps of Christ. And the world hated him. And he says, the world will hate you too. Keep this in the back of your mind. If you're suffering righteously, you're suffering so that people around you might live. Sometimes it's hard when we're in the middle of our suffering to get outside of ourselves and realize it's not all about us. The reality is God often uses our own suffering to help other people live. I'll give you an example. Sandy, would you allow me to give the same example that I gave to the play people? We did Joseph play in February, and that was a chaotic time for me. It was crazy. We were doing rehearsals, and there was a Saturday rehearsal, all morning rehearsal. The Saturday, the week after, my dad had a massive stroke. So no sleep happened that week. And I spent that Friday night in the hospital doing the overnight shift with my mom. And then I woke up Saturday morning and was supposed to go to rehearsal for the play. You don't sleep in a hospital. I mean, come on. They're coming in every 3 hours, and they're checking stuff, and stuff's beeping, and door closes, opens, and you don't sleep. Not to mention you're trying to figure out if, you even can close your eyes for 2 seconds because you're supposed to be the one there watching them. And so I didn't sleep at all. The week before, Sandy Wood had asked, is there anything I can do for you? And I had been noticing that I hadn't been eating, because when craziness happens, sometimes you skip meals, whatever. And so when I did eat, I didn't ever plan meals. I just went out, and I was sick of eating out. So I asked Sandy, I said, you live close to the church. Can I just come over to your house randomly and get food? Can I just show up on your doorstep and eat? Because I haven't been meal prepping, and I'm sick of eating out, and I'm hungry. And she said, yes. And so I said, okay, great. I'll do that sometime. It was 3 days later. Saturday morning, I'm coming from the hospital. Of course, I don't have breakfast, and I didn't plan anything. And I know Sandy was also in the play, and I know she has to get up and go to rehearsal too. So rehearsal's at 9, and I leave the hospital at 8. And on my way, I literally call Sandy, and I'm like, can I come over to your house for breakfast? Because I'm hungry, and I've got no sleep, and this sounds just stupid. I have no idea why I'm going to a rehearsal right now. This sounds dumb, and I'm not even good at singing. So what the heck? And she says, yeah, sure. So go over to her house. She makes me breakfast. And as we're sitting there talking, she says to me, I was thinking about not going this morning. She said, because I was having a really rough morning, and I didn't sleep that well either, and I'm just really tired, and I just didn't know that I could do an extended thing. She said, but then you showed up at my house. And I needed someone to come and get me out of bed. So I had to get ready so I could go to rehearsal. I wasn't doing anything wrong. And yet I was hungry and tired. She wasn't doing anything wrong. Yet she was tired. And somehow God knew that when we're able to suffer together for each other, she didn't have to get out of bed and make me breakfast. That people around you gain life. That's something that I wouldn't have been able to do on my own, because she was willing to say, you know what? He needs to eat. And get out of bed and make me breakfast. That people around you gain life. That's what Paul's talking about. Sometimes your suffering is not just for you. Sometimes it's so that people around you can have life. And that life at the end of the day returns in a circle of thankfulness and more grace and glory to God. That's what it's supposed to look like. It doesn't always happen, but that's what it's supposed to look like. There's a lot of different ways we can understand communion. Most basically, communion was instituted to remember the death of Christ. Every time you do this, remember that he died. Hold on to that. Don't lose that. Maybe at its most intricate, some level of spiritual connection between you and God that I can't explain to you. But today, as we come and take the body that Christ said was broken for you, and then it was, and take the cup that he said is the blood poured out for you, and it was. What I want you to do is ask yourself the question before you come up here and then listen for an answer. Am I following in the footsteps of Christ? And just ask him and be willing to listen for whatever answer he gives you. He might tell you, you're doing pretty good. He might say to you, yeah. I mean, it ain't perfect, but nobody's gonna be. You're doing pretty good. Or he might tell you, dude, you need to sort this area of your life out. But whatever it is, this is the time to meet with God. Ask him that question. Am I following in your footsteps? He knows better than anyone else. I'll pray for us. You take a few minutes to ask that question and listen for what God says. And then when you're ready, if you're a believer, come up and take the bread, can dip it, can take it as you're ready. Father in heaven, I got to be honest, I don't know that we see this pattern very much in the church, and I wish we saw it more. God, would you make us a people who are willing to suffer so that other people might live? Would you help us to understand it's not all about us? Would you show us what proper suffering looks like so that we don't go on getting abused? So that we know how to walk that fine line of this is suffering that might result in life, and this is not good suffering and I need to get out. You're the only one who knows those things, God. So would you show us? God, I pray you would answer each person's question in this room however they need it answered. In whatever way you speak to them, God, would you answer the question, am I following you? Am I walking after you? Not just believing, God, but are we following you? Answer that question. Thanks for communing with us, God. Thanks for your Son.